Frame rates. What does that mean? And how do you utilize them to make visually stunning videos? That's what we're going to talk about today. So frame rates are the thing that you choose before you even press the record button. The reason I say this is because each frame rate that you could choose has a different and specific use case. 24 frames per second. This is a standard regular motion frame rate. If you shoot in 24 frames per second, you're wanting to shoot a video like this, talking head, a scene where two characters are interacting and they're just talking to each other. There's no slow motion involved. There's no special effects involved. It's just a standard motion video. 30 frames per second. This is the standard for broadcast television. So when I say broadcast television, I mean live streams. Like Instagram Live, Facebook Live. If you watch like Fox News or CNN, they are going to be broadcasting in 30 frames per second. But for you, somebody who's a beginner, who's creating videos, 30 frames per second can be used to slow your video down by like 20% and give a little bit of a dreamy slow motion look, but not too much slow motion to where it's distracting from maybe a storyline you're trying to tell. 60 frames per second. This is one of the primary frame rates that allows you to slow your video down by a pretty significant amount so you can achieve what's called slow motion. And it's exactly what it says, slow motion. You have more frames per second of video. So that means you can slow your video down substantially to achieve slow motion. Now, where you would want to use slow motion is wherever you want. If you want to make something look really, really dreamy and cinematic and like, you know, these two characters are running through like a meadow or something like that. And you want to slow them down and you want to make it feel like a dream and like these two characters are in love and like they're having these moments that are really, really slowed down and you want to like, get into their minds and like, oh wow, they're really loving each other. That's a specific example of where you would use 60 frames per second to have slow motion, or something like The Matrix, but you mainly want to use 120 frames per second for effects you would find in movies like The Matrix, because 120 frames per second is double the amount of frames as 60. And what this does is allows you to slow your footage down tremendously so you can achieve very, very slow motion effects in your videos. Now, these are meant for very, very specific looks. Like I said, the example I used was The Matrix. That's a very, very specific movie that utilizes probably much higher than 120 frames per second on some of their cameras. But 120 is where I'm going to stop because that's what, most cameras stop at in terms of prosumer cameras. So you'll only shoot in 120 frames per second when you want to achieve super slow motion footage. It wouldn't do you any good to shoot in 120 or 60 frames per second or even really 30 frames per second if you're just wanting to shoot a video like this, something simple where two characters are talking or an interview style video, because you won't really utilize those extra frames per second. You should just go ahead and shoot in 24 frames per second and you'll be able to achieve a much more natural motion blur because you won't be slowing the footage down. Now, here are a couple extra tips for you on frame rates. Here's a mistake that I made personally whenever I was early along in my journey in video production. I would shoot in 60 frames per second with no intention of slowing the video down to utilize the extra frames for the slow motion effect. I would play it back in real time with those 60 frames per second on my timeline in my editing software, and the video would look weird. And it wouldn't look like the movies that I've seen. And I didn't know why, but it's because I was shooting in 60 frames per second when the cinematic standard for the most natural looking motion in your videos is 24 frames per second. So before you decide to shoot your video, you need to determine what shots are going to be slowed down and what shots are going to be regular speed, like something like this. It always helps to plan out your videos ahead of time. Another mistake I made is I thought I could shoot in 24 frames per second all the time, no matter what, and slow down the footage anyways. Wrong. So essentially what happened is I shot in 24 frames per second thinking I could slow the footage down, not knowing that I didn't have those extra frames within each second of video to utilize for that slow motion effect. So what happens when I tried to slow the 24 frames per second video down, the footage got really, really choppy and it looked horrendous. So I couldn't use those video clips for a slow motion effect unless you use some sort of AI software after the fact. That would probably make it possible. But even then, it would still look a little bit unnatural. But who knows? AI is getting really, really good nowadays. And these new AI tools in your editing softwares that you probably have right now, like DaVinci Resolve is what I use, man, they are getting really, really good. Something else you should keep in mind when adjusting your frame rate or determining what frame rate you're going to be shooting in for your video, you should adjust your shutter speed accordingly. So like I've talked about earlier in earlier videos, when shooting at 24 frames per second, you should automatically set your shutter speed to 1/48. When shooting in 30 frames per second, you should automatically adjust your shutter speed to 1/60. When shooting 60 frames per second, you should automatically adjust your shutter speed to 1/120. And when shooting at 120 frames per second, you should automatically adjust your shutter speed to 1/240. This ensures that you have the most natural looking motion blur in whatever frame rate rate you choose. So the moral of the story with frame rates is you should intentionally pick your frame rates before you decide to start shooting your video, so you're not just guessing. Plan ahead saves you hours in post-production. My name is Hayden Cornfloss, and I'm an in-house video producer for an 8-figure national brand here in the USA. And this channel exists to teach you how to do exactly what I do. So if that's something you're interested in, go ahead and hit the subscribe button, and I will see you in the next one.